Welcome back to our channel. We're so grateful for your support and hope you enjoy this story we've prepared for you. Without further ado, let's dive in. Jonathan Carver wiped the sweat from his forehead as he dug through the dusty attic of his suburban Chicago home. At 38, the high school history teacher still had the energy for weekend projects, like tackling the long-overdue task of cleaning out the attic. "What's this?" he muttered, pulling out an old leather photo album hidden behind a pile of old magazines. Settling onto a weathered trunk, Jonathan opened the album. A wave of nostalgia washed over him as he flipped through the pictures of his Irish-American family. His gaze lingered on a recent family photo. "Em's grown so much," he mused, examining his 14-year-old daughter's face. Something nagged at the back of his mind as he turned to a picture of himself at her age, comparing the two. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. Emma's nose had a slight curve, and though her eyes were blue like his, they had an almond shape he couldn't place in the family lineage. Jonathan continued flipping until he found a photo of his 12-year-old son, Liam. The boy's complexion was slightly darker, and his hair a richer shade of brown than Jonathan's. It's probably nothing, he told himself, trying to dismiss the growing unease. But the more he studied the photos, the more a seed of doubt began to take root. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jonathan sat hunched over his laptop in the dim light of his study. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed DNA test kits. "What are you doing?" Christina's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, her expression curious. Jonathan quickly closed the laptop. "Oh, just looking up some stuff for class," he lied, feeling a twinge of guilt. "Heading to bed soon?" Christina asked, nodding, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Don't stay up too late. Good night, love." As she padded away, Jonathan reopened his laptop and placed an order for 3 DNA test kits. His heart pounded as he hit the confirm purchase button, wondering what truths might come to light. The following weeks dragged by, each day tormenting Jonathan as he waited for the DNA results. He found himself studying his children's faces at breakfast, searching for any resemblance to himself or Christina. Finally, an email arrived. With trembling hands, Jonathan opened the attachment. His own results were as expected a mix of Irish and other European ancestry, but Emma and Liam's results made his heart race. Both showed a significant percentage of Mexican heritage, but "This can't be right," he whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. That night, after tossing and turning in bed, Jonathan made a decision he would hire a private investigator to uncover the truth. The next day, he met with a private investigator named Frank in a small, unremarkable coffee shop. "So what exactly are we looking for here?" Frank asked, his expression unreadable. Jonathan leaned in, lowering his voice. "I need to know if my wife has been unfaithful, and if so, with whom." Frank nodded and jotted down notes. "Any suspects?" Jonathan shook his head. "I have no idea. But the kids, they might not be mine." 2 weeks later, Frank called with an update. "Mr. Carver, you should come by my office. There's something you need to see." Jonathan's stomach churned as he looked at the photographs spread across Frank's desk. There, in the pictures, was his wife, Christina, in the arms of another man. A man whose features eerily mirrored those of Emma and Liam. "His name is Miguel Ramirez," Frank explained. "He's Christina's boss at the construction company. They've been involved for at least 15 years longer than your marriage." Jonathan's world spun. 15 years? But we've only been married for. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carver," Frank interrupted. "There's more." He slid over a stack of papers, love letters, emails, hotel receipts. "The affair has been ongoing, and it's been intense." As Jonathan sifted through the evidence, his world collapsed. Every tender moment, every cherished memory, all tainted by this colossal betrayal. "Who is he?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely audible. "Miguel Ramirez," Frank repeated. "He's a major player in the local construction industry. He's also known for his philanthropy and Mexican heritage." Everything clicked into place. Jonathan stared at a photo of Miguel, recognizing the similarities between the man and his children. "My whole life. It's been a lie," he murmured, more to himself than to Frank. Overwhelmed by the revelation, Jonathan knew he needed support. He decided to confide in his family, hoping for some comfort. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, he gathered his parents and siblings at his childhood home, where the scent of his mother's apple pie once brought him peace. Now it made his stomach turn. I have something to tell you all," Jonathan began, his voice shaky. He recounted the discovery of the photo, the DNA test results, and the devastating findings of the private investigator. As he spoke, he noticed a strange silence in the room. His mother wouldn't meet his eyes, his father shifted uncomfortably, and his sister Sarah exchanged a glance with their brother Michael. "What's going on?" Jonathan demanded, fear creeping into his voice. "What aren't you telling me?" Sarah was the first to speak. "Johnny, we knew." Jonathan felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "You knew? What do you mean you knew?" His father cleared his throat. "Son, we found out about Christina's affair a few years ago. We thought it was best not to tell you." "Best not to tell me?" Jonathan's voice rose, a mix of disbelief and anger coursing through him. "You let me live a lie. You let me raise children that aren't even mine." His mother reached out a hand. "We thought we were protecting you, dear. You seemed so happy." Jonathan recoiled from her touch. "Happy? I was living in ignorance. How could you keep this from me?" Michael's voice took on a defensive tone. "We didn't want to hurt you, bro. We thought what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you." Jonathan laughed bitterly. "Look at me now. Tell me this doesn't hurt." He stood abruptly, unable to bear the sight of his family any longer. The people he had trusted the most had betrayed him, just like Christina had. "Johnny, please," his mother pleaded. "We can talk about this. We can help you through it." But Jonathan was already heading for the door. "I don't need your help," he spat. "I don't need any of you." As he stormed out into the fading afternoon light, Jonathan had never felt more alone. His wife, his children, even his family, everything he'd believed in had been built on lies. In that crushing moment of isolation, a cold determination settled over him. He couldn't trust anyone he once held dear. The only person he could rely on now was himself. Driving home, Jonathan's mind raced, overwhelmed by the enormity of the betrayals he'd uncovered. But one thought kept surfacing: he would take control. He would get his revenge. The sun was setting on Jonathan Carver's old life, and with it, the naive, trusting man he once was. In his place stood someone hardened by deceit, resolved to reclaim control of his destiny. Jonathan sat alone in his classroom, staring at the rows of empty desks. The weight of the recent revelations pressed on him, feeling like a physical burden. He hadn't slept well in weeks, his mind constantly replaying the betrayals he had uncovered. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Principal Simmons stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "Got a minute?" John Simmons asked, though it was clear it wasn't really a question. Jonathan nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Simmons eased into the chair, the plastic creaking under his weight. "There's no easy way to say this," he began, "but the school board is pushing through a new history curriculum. And, well, it's not good." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, not good?" Simmons sighed and handed over a folder. "See for yourself." As Jonathan flipped through the documents, his frown deepened. The proposed changes were worse than not good. They were a blatant whitewashing of history. "This is," Jonathan started, then paused, remembering who he was talking to. "I mean, this is ridiculous." Simmons nodded. "You're right, but the board's under pressure from some big donors. They're forcing this through whether we like it or not." A familiar anger stirred in Jonathan, the same fury that had been brewing since he uncovered the truth about his family. But this time, it was something he could fight. "We can't let this happen," he said, his voice low and steady. Simmons raised an eyebrow. "We, John? I'm with you, but my hands are tied. The board." "Screw the board," Jonathan cut in. "These kids deserve better. They deserve the truth." For a moment, Simmons looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. "You're right, but what can we do?" Jonathan began pacing the room, his mind once clouded by personal turmoil suddenly clear. "We organize. Teachers, parents, students. We make our voices heard." As he spoke, a plan began to form in his mind, This wasn't just about the curriculum, it was an outlet for the anger and frustration that had been building inside him. It was something he could channel into a cause that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan threw himself into the fight. He organized meetings, drafted petitions, and rallied support from across the school community. One evening, while putting the finishing touches on a presentation for the upcoming board meeting, his daughter Emma peeked into his home office. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "can I talk to you?" Jonathan looked up, guilt immediately washing over him. In his single-minded focus on the curriculum battle, he had barely spoken to his kids. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Emma perched on the edge of his desk, her feet swinging nervously. "Is everything okay? You've been different lately." Jonathan's heart ached. He wanted to tell her everything, the truth about her real father, the lies, the pain. But looking at her worried face, he couldn't bring himself to destroy her world. "I'm sorry, Em," he said softly. "There's been a lot going on at school, but I promise everything's going to be fine." Emma nodded, but her eyes still held doubt. "Is that why Mom's been crying at night?" Her question hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He had been so consumed by his anger and the fight against the school board that he hadn't even noticed Christina's distress. I didn't know she was crying," he admitted. "She tries to hide it," Emma said, shrugging. "But I hear her sometimes." Jonathan pulled his daughter into a hug, his mind racing. He had been neglecting his family, using the fight against the curriculum as an excuse to avoid confronting the pain at home. But wasn't that just another way of running from the truth? "I'll talk to her," he promised, "and I'm sorry I've been so distracted. How about a family game night tomorrow?" Emma's face brightened. "Really? Can we play Monopoly?" Jonathan chuckled, the sound unfamiliar to him after so long. "Sure, kiddo, Monopoly it is." As Emma skipped out of the room, Jonathan turned back to his computer. The fight against the curriculum changes was important, but so was his family, even if that family wasn't exactly what he had always believed. He would have to find a balance. And he needed to make a decision about what to do with the truth he now carried. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan found himself living a double life. By day, he was the passionate teacher leading the charge against the school board's curriculum changes. By night, he was a man consumed by thoughts of revenge. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, he sat in his study, surrounded by financial records and legal documents. The private investigator, Frank, had uncovered more than just proof of the affair. He had found financial discrepancies at Miguel's construction company, potential tax fraud that could bring the entire operation crashing down. Jonathan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, knowing that with just a few clicks, he could send an anonymous tip to the IRS. It would trigger a chain reaction that could topple Miguel's entire life. But was that truly what he wanted? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Christina stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "John, can we talk?" he nodded, quickly minimizing the windows on his screen. Christina perched on the edge of his desk, her eyes swollen from crying. "I'm worried about you," she said softly. "You've been so distant lately. Is it because of me?" Jonathan felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. If only she knew. No, he lied, the word tasting bitter. "It's just this whole thing with the school board. It's taking up a lot of my time." Christina nodded, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. "I miss you," she whispered, reaching for his hand. For a moment, Jonathan nearly gave in, nearly told her everything he knew and everything he felt. But then the images Frank had shown him, the letters, the 15 years of deceit flooded his mind. He pulled his hand away. "I'm sorry," he said, avoiding her gaze. "I just need some space." Christina's face fell, but she nodded and left the room. Jonathan turned back to his computer. The next day, he met with a divorce attorney, a man known for his aggressive tactics and high success rate. "So, Mr. Carver," the attorney began, leaning back in his leather chair, "what are we dealing with?" Jonathan recounted the entire sordid tale, the affair, the paternity of his children, his family's betrayal. The attorney's eyes gleamed with interest. "This is juicy," he said, rubbing his hands together. "We'll take her for everything she's got." But Jonathan shook his head. "No," he said firmly, "I don't want to hurt the kids. I just want justice." The attorney nodded, though Jonathan could sense his disappointment. "All right, we'll play it your way. But trust me, in situations like this, striking hard and fast is usually best." As Jonathan left the office, he felt a mixture of relief and dread. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Over the following weeks, Jonathan quietly put his plan into action. He began liquidating joint assets, moving funds into accounts only he could access. He gathered all the evidence Frank had uncovered, building a rock-solid case against Christina and Miguel. Then, one night, confident that Christina was fast asleep, he made the call to the IRS. His voice trembled as he reported the tax fraud at Miguel's company, but he pushed through, determined to see it to the end. As he hung up, Jonathan felt a strange mix of exhilaration and emptiness. Part of him was thrilled to finally be taking control after weeks of helplessness, but another part of him felt hollow. Would revenge really bring him the closure he sought? He pushed the doubts aside. It was too late to turn back now. The night of Miguel's company gala arrived. Jonathan stood in front of the bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. Christina appeared behind him, looking radiant in a shimmering evening gown. "You look handsome," she said, catching his eyes in the mirror. Jonathan forced a smile. "Thanks. You look beautiful." For a fleeting moment, he felt himself wavering. The woman standing behind him was the same one he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But then the memories of her betrayal came flooding back, and his resolve solidified once again. The gala was held in a grand ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow over Chicago's construction elite. Jonathan watched from the sidelines as Christina glided through the crowd, laughing and mingling with ease. She was the perfect corporate wife. Then Jonathan spotted him Miguel Ramirez, looking dapper in a tailored tuxedo, holding court near the bar. Jonathan's fists clenched involuntarily. This was the man who had fathered his children, who had been with his wife for 15 years. Jonathan bided his time throughout the evening, making small talk and nursing a single glass of whiskey. Finally, Miguel took the stage, his voice booming with confidence as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miguel began, "I'm thrilled to announce that this has been our most successful year yet. The future of Ramirez Construction has never looked brighter." The room erupted into applause. Jonathan saw his chance. He stood and made his way toward the podium with determined strides, feeling Christina's confused gaze on him. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, cutting through the applause. "I have something to add." Miguel's smile wavered, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, John," he said, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jonathan Carver, husband of our wonderful HR director, Christina." Jonathan took the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment. "Thank you, Miguel," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I just wanted to congratulate you on all your success. What you've built here is impressive." He paused, scanning the room. Christina stood frozen, her face drained of color. "But I think it's time we all got honest with each other," Jonathan continued. "Honest about the real foundation of this company's success." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "I have here the results of DNA tests, proving that Miguel Ramirez is the biological father of my children. I also have evidence of a 15-year affair between Mr. Ramirez and my wife, Christina." The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Miguel's face turned ashen, his knuckles white as he gripped the podium. "But that's not all," Jonathan continued, his voice rising above the chaos. "I also have documents outlining years of tax fraud and embezzlement at Ramirez Construction documents that are now in the hands of both the IRS and the FBI." Pandemonium ensued. Board members leapt to their feet, shouting questions. Investors pushed toward the exits. And in the midst of the turmoil stood Miguel and Christina, their carefully constructed world collapsing around them. Jonathan watched as the company owner, face flushed with fury, stormed toward Miguel. "You're fired," he shouted, his voice booming. "And you can bet we'll cooperate fully with any investigation." Christina stumbled toward Jonathan, tears streaming down her face. "John," she pleaded, her voice breaking, "how could you do this?" Jonathan stared at her, feeling an odd mix of satisfaction and sorrow. "How could I?" he asked quietly. "How could you, Christina? 15 years of lies, our entire marriage a complete sham." As security began clearing the ballroom, Jonathan turned and walked away. Behind him, he could hear Christina's sobs and Miguel's frantic attempts to calm the enraged board members, but Jonathan didn't look back. Stepping outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap. He loosened his tie and took a few deep breaths. It was done. His revenge was finished, but instead of feeling triumph, Jonathan was left with an empty hollowness where his anger had once burned. He hailed a cab, gave the driver his home address, and watched the city lights blur past, wondering what came next. He had torn down the lie his life had become, but now he had to figure out how to rebuild something real from the wreckage. The morning after the gala, Jonathan Carver awoke to a world that felt irrevocably changed. The taste of victory was bitter, mixed with the remnants of anger and betrayal. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he wondered if the emptiness in his chest would ever be filled again. His phone buzzed relentlessly. News of the confrontation had spread quickly through Chicago's business and social circles. Ignoring the calls and messages, Jonathan focused on the next step in his meticulously planned revenge. At 9 a.m. sharp, Jonathan walked into the offices of Harley Associates, home to Chicago's most notorious divorce lawyer, Bernard Harley. Harley was known for his ruthless tactics, leaving opposing parties with little more than the clothes on their backs. His office, all mahogany and leather, overlooked Lake Michigan, a view as expensive as his services. The lawyer himself was a contrast: an expensive suit, a cheap haircut, and the predatory eyes of someone who thrived on conflict. Mr. Carver, Harley greeted, rising to shake Jonathan's hand. "I heard about last night. Quite the spectacle." Jonathan nodded and took a seat. "I want this done quickly and cleanly, Mr. Harley. Everything you need is in here." He placed a thick folder of evidence on the desk. Harley's eyes gleamed as he flipped through the documents. "Oh, this is good. Very good indeed. We can." "No," Jonathan interrupted firmly. "I don't want to destroy her. I just want what's fair, and I want the kids." Harley's excitement dimmed, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Carver. We'll proceed as you wish." In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Christina, backed into a corner by the overwhelming evidence against her, barely fought back. Her once pristine appearance had deteriorated, replaced by dark circles under her eyes and a look of permanent defeat. The judge's ruling was swift. Jonathan was granted full custody of Emma and Liam, along with most of their shared assets. Christina was left with a small alimony payment and visitation rights, which felt more like a hollow consolation prize than a win. As Jonathan exited the courthouse, he caught a glimpse of Christina, slumped on a bench with her head in her hands. For a brief moment he felt a flicker of pity, but then he remembered the years of deceit, the betrayal that had torn his life apart, and he walked on without looking back. Meanwhile, across town, Miguel Ramirez was enduring his own downfall. The IRS investigation Jonathan had triggered revealed years of tax fraud and embezzlement. Miguel's once stellar reputation in the construction industry was in ruins. Desperate to recoup his losses and maintain his luxurious lifestyle, he turned to gambling. It started small with bets at legitimate casinos, but as his desperation grew, so did his risks. Soon he was drawn into Chicago's underworld of illegal gambling. One night, in the smoky back room of a rundown bar, Miguel sat at a poker table, sweat dripping from his brow. He was down to his last chip, having already lost his savings, his home, and any hope of regaining his standing in the industry. But all in he croaked, pushing the lone chip forward. The dealer, a man with lifeless eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, dealt the final card. Miguel's hand trembled as he turned over his cards. "House wins," the dealer said, his voice devoid of emotion. Miguel stumbled from the table, his world spinning. In just a few months he had gone from being one of Chicago's most respected businessmen to a penniless gambler drowning in debt. As he wandered out into the cold night, Miguel realized that the life he had built, founded on lies and deceit, had completely crumbled. And somewhere across the city, Jonathan Carver slept soundly for the first time in months, his revenge finally complete. The for sale sign stood stark against the manicured lawn of the Carver family home. Jonathan watched from the driveway as the realtor hammered it into place, each strike of the mallet feeling like another nail in the coffin of his old life. Dad, Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Are we really leaving?" Jonathan turned to his daughter, seeing a mix of uncertainty and hope in her eyes. At 14, Emma was old enough to grasp the broad strokes of what had happened, though not all the sordid details. "Yeah, sweetheart," Jonathan said, pulling her into a hug. "We are." "It's time for a fresh start," Jonathan thought as Liam bolted out of the house, his boundless 12-year-old energy unaffected by the turmoil of the last few months. "I call shotgun on the moving truck," Liam shouted, racing past them toward the driveway. Jonathan couldn't help but smile. Despite the lies, betrayal, and the very public spectacle of the divorce, his children had shown a resilience that amazed him every day. They had chosen to stay with him, recognizing his unwavering love and support, even after the shocking revelation about their biological father. Moving to a new town wasn't just about a change of scenery. It was an opportunity to rebuild, a chance to create a life free from the weight of past deceptions. Jonathan had accepted a position as the principal of Oage Academy, a respected private school known for its innovative approach to teaching history. As they pulled away from the house for the last time, Jonathan caught a glimpse of their neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains, undoubtedly relieved to see the Carvers leave after the scandal that had consumed their quiet suburban street. The drive to their new home was a mix of excited chatter from the kids and long stretches of reflective silence. Jonathan's thoughts drifted to the curriculum debate that had absorbed him during his personal crisis. His victory in that battle had gained him respect in educational circles, opening doors he'd never thought possible. As they crossed the state line, leaving behind the familiar skyline of Chicago, Jonathan felt a burden lift from his shoulders. The anger that had fueled him for so long began to fade, replaced by cautious optimism for what lay ahead. Their new home was smaller, but it felt brighter. Large windows filled the rooms with sunlight, casting an inviting glow that spoke of fresh beginnings. As Emma and Liam dashed around the house, claiming bedrooms and arguing over closet space, Jonathan stood in the empty living room, taking it all in. The first few weeks in their new town were a blur of unpacking, preparing for school, and meeting neighbors. Jonathan immersed himself in his new role at Oage Academy, determined to make a lasting impact on the students. During this time, he realized that simply moving on wasn't enough. He needed to heal. The betrayal he had experienced had left deep scars, wounds that wouldn't heal on their own. On a whim, he decided to start a support group for people who had been betrayed by their spouses. The first meeting, held in a modest room at the local community center, drew just 3 people besides himself. "My name is John," he began, his voice a bit shaky, "and I'm here because my wife of 15 years had an affair with her boss, an affair that resulted in the 2 children I thought were mine." As he spoke, Jonathan felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. Sharing his story, speaking his truth to others who understood, brought a cathartic release he hadn't expected. Week by week the group grew. People from all walks of life, united by the common thread of betrayal, found comfort and strength in one another's stories. Jonathan found a sense of purpose in helping others navigate the turbulent waters of broken trust and shattered relationships. It was at one of these meetings that Jonathan met Alexandra. She sat quietly at the back of the room, her dark hair framing a face that spoke of both strength and vulnerability. When she finally shared her story, her resilience struck a deep chord with Jonathan. After the meeting, they lingered, talking easily. Alexandra, it turned out, was also a teacher, a history educator at a nearby high school. "I've heard great things about your work at Oage," she said, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "Your approach to teaching history is really inspiring." Jonathan felt warmth spread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "It's been challenging but incredibly rewarding." As weeks turned into months, their friendship deepened. They challenged each other intellectually, exchanging ideas about education and life. Alexandra encouraged Jonathan to push boundaries, to think beyond conventional teaching methods. One evening, after an intense discussion about education and social justice, they walked through a local park. Jonathan realized that the emptiness he had carried for so long was slowly being replaced by something new, something hopeful. He glanced at Alexandra and saw the same realization in her eyes. Slowly, tentatively, they leaned in, sharing their first kiss, a gentle, cautious moment that promised something real and honest. As they pulled back, Jonathan admitted, I'm not sure I'm ready for this." Alexandra squeezed his hand gently. "That's okay," she said softly. "We've got time." For the first time in years, Jonathan felt a genuine hope for the future. 5 years passed in a blur of school events, family dinners, and quiet evenings with Alexandra. Jonathan's life had settled into a rhythm he once thought impossible after the divorce. Emma, now 19, was thriving in her first year of college, and Liam, 17, had become captain of his high school debate team. His sharp wit and passion for justice filled Jonathan with pride. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came. Jonathan was in his office at Oage Academy, reviewing applications for a new history teacher, when his phone buzzed. The number was familiar, and something told him he needed to answer. "Hello," Jonathan said. "John." "It's Rebecca." Christina's sister. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't heard from anyone in Christina's family since the divorce. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" he asked. There was a pause, thick with unspoken words. "It's Christina," Rebecca said, her voice faltering. "She's gone, John. She passed away last night." The world tilted beneath him. Jonathan gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening. "What happened?" It was her heart. Rebecca's voice cracked. "An undiagnosed condition. She passed in her sleep." As Rebecca went on, explaining the funeral arrangements and the legal matters, Jonathan sat in stunned silence, trying to process the news. Jonathan felt strangely distant as Rebecca delivered the news of Christina's passing. There was no joy in hearing it, but neither did he experience the deep sadness he might have anticipated. It felt more like hearing about the death of someone he barely knew, rather than the woman he had once promised to love forever. What truly shocked him, however, were Rebecca's next words. "John, there's something else you need to know," she said, her voice weighed down with guilt and sorrow. "Christina, she's been struggling these past few years. After the divorce, after everything with Miguel, she couldn't find work in her field. The scandal, you know." Jonathan listened in stunned silence as Rebecca painted a bleak picture of Christina's final years. Unable to find a job in human resources or in any corporate setting, she had ended up working as a janitor at a local community college. She had been living in a shabby, run-down apartment, barely getting by. "And Miguel?" Jonathan asked, though he wasn't sure why he cared. Rebecca's bitter laugh echoed through the phone. "That bastard ran off to Mexico about a year ago. Gambling debts, from what I heard. Left Christina to fend for herself." When the call ended, Jonathan sat alone in his office, the silence heavy around him. The life he had carefully rebuilt over the last 5 years suddenly felt fragile, as if the ghosts of his past could reach out and shatter it at any moment. That evening, he gathered Emma and Liam in the living room. Alexandra sat nearby, her steady presence offering quiet support. "Kids," Jonathan began, his voice calm despite the turmoil within. "I have some news about your mother." He watched them closely as he shared the details, ready to offer comfort or explanations if needed. But his children, now young adults, handled the news with a maturity that both surprised and saddened him. "Do you think we should go to the funeral?" Emma asked softly, her voice small. Jonathan gazed at his daughter, recognizing glimpses of Christina in her face. "That's something we should decide together," he said gently. "It's okay if you want to go, and it's okay if you don't." After a lengthy discussion, filled with moments of silence and shared tears, they agreed as a family to attend the funeral. Not out of obligation, Jonathan realized, but as a final act of closure, a way to end a chapter that had shaped all of their lives. The day of the funeral dawned cold and grey. Jonathan stood between Emma and Liam at the graveside, their hands clasped tightly in his. As the priest recited the final prayers, Jonathan's mind wandered, reflecting on the winding road that had led him to this moment. Yes, his pursuit of revenge had brought some measure of justice, but standing there, watching his children say goodbye to a mother they barely knew, he understood that it hadn't brought him happiness. That had come later through his resilience, his devotion to his children, and his commitment to his values. As they turned to leave the cemetery, Jonathan gave his children's hands a reassuring squeeze. He looked at them, truly seeing them, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they now shared, a life built on honesty and unconditional love, free from the lies and betrayals of the past. They made their way toward the car, where Alexandra was waiting. Her presence was a comforting reminder of the new chapter they were building together, a chapter grounded in trust, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. As they drove away from the cemetery, leaving behind the last physical connection to their old life, Jonathan felt a peaceful calm settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer feared the journey. He had his children, he had Alexandra, and he had built a life based on truth. The ghosts of the past would always linger in the background, but they no longer had any power over him. Jonathan glanced in the rearview mirror at Emma and Liam, who were quietly talking, their heads close together. In that moment he knew with absolute certainty that, despite all the pain and heartache, he wouldn't change a thing. It was through those trials that they had forged this new family, one bound not by blood or promises, but by choice, love, and a steadfast commitment to honesty. The future stretched out before them, like a blank canvas waiting to be filled with new memories, new triumphs, and new love. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Carver felt truly, deeply happy. This brings our story to a close. Share your thoughts in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I'll see you there.